While searching for meaning in life and truth, you have to get to the heart of issues. So there are three ways that I, as a leader, and this is not, I'm not giving you a generic leadership term, okay? This is me, specific to me, my pastorate, my life, okay? I'm not the great thinker here, okay? But I have to think in certain ways about three things. I have to be the thinker about theology. So when my listeners and those who are attending and listening to me preach, teach, number one, theologically, I have to be a theologian. I have to give the Christocentric view of issues and how it applies to their life. The second thing that I have to be as a thinker, number one, theological. Number two, critical and deep thinker. I cannot give the shallow answer because my listener will say, if he gave a cheap shot on that, what else is he being cheap about? If he is doing the knee-jerk reaction to that, is he doing the knee-jerk reaction when he's putting together a sermon? Or if he would be cheap and shallow on that issue, is this his weather pattern or is this his climate? And so if I think shallow about an issue, when I come to the eternal and I come to the major issues in life, there will be the assumption that he's cheap and shallow about that. The other thing that I have to think about is the philosophy of how I think. So I have to think theologically. I have to think critically and give deep insight to issues. And then thirdly, I got to think of a philosophy. Because what I'm presenting is a philosophy of life, a worldview in which you can put these lenses on, and this is the experience you're going to get. Now, I could be accurate in theology, I could be very insightful, but if my philosophy of life is so absurdly constricted or miserable or moody, you're not going to want to follow that. Because you're going to say, okay, if I take that theology and I put it with that insight, am I going to have to live as mad and miserable as that man? You're not going to want that. So I have to think in these ways. Well, when your life kind of revolves around thinking critically and insightfully about things, you stop just using the same tired, worn-out myths that everyone presents. Now, you're in a culture that does it ad nauseum. Just it's like rinse and repeat. Oh, and every news cycle it does it. There's an interesting story. I'm not going to bring it up right now because I'd have to do too much research, and Thomas would have to work on it to get it all laid out. But there is a woman that wrote a book in 1963. Okay, every single calamity or tragedy or thing that happened, whether it's a riot in Chicago, whether it's the bombing of a nation, or airplanes flying into the World Trade Center, she has republished her book every time. I don't know if she adds anything new to it, but it's a rinse and repeat. Now, what's fascinating is when you think about like people who are antagonists to Christianity. They're always ready to just hurl the Crusades. Now, I am no fan of the Crusades, okay? And to me, they are the number one most disqualifying thing that the Catholic Church has ever done outside of the Inquisition, okay? But what happens is we start living on the cheap repeat myths, and we don't actually think deeply and critically about it. There was a fascinating article that came out, and it was years ago that a man wrote it, but it's about Crusades and the myth that the Crusades were just the Catholic Church going over there and doing something arbitrarily or random. So he kind of unpacks it and goes through it, that when the city was, it talks about it, when the city was recaptured by Turkish Muslims in 1076, the atmosphere changed. Pilgrims were attacked, city patriarchs were kidnapped, holy places were desecrated. The cries for help from Eastern Christians prompted Pope Urban II to call a conference of leaders in France in 1095, and they decided that it was so bad, it had gotten so bad, that they were going to intervene. That's the first point, okay? Now, what they did is they sent this Frankish crusader group of Anglo-Saxons and France, and they went there. They got there, they were half starved. They besieged the city. They actually did win Jerusalem back. But the problem is that when they got in there, they committed all kinds of atrocities. So nobody's defending that. All I'm saying is that when you think about the history, go read Thomas F. Madden. Thomas F. Madden, a brilliant writer, and he writes on the Crusades, and he gives you a bit of a deeper insight and a different angle. Now, the anti-Semitic murders that they committed, the stuff that they did, that doesn't excuse any of that. But when Thomas Madden writes his book, he lays it out very well that this is not what you have thought. Now, the other thing he says, Thomas Madden said the Crusades is one of the most misunderstood events in Western history, and notes that recent popular histories have recycled myths long ago dispelled by historians. That's what I want to get at in this podcast. The episode is that you can't just be cheap. And let me say this, because we're in the political cycle. I assume that this comes out after the election, and you've watched all this. And if you're not careful, you're just going to be badgering about, throwing out, the latest thing. And it's important that we as Christians think deeply, think critically, and transcend the arguments, okay? And rise above it a little bit, and understand that it's not as simple as people think, okay? So there's a couple things, and I've went on this before on the podcast. You think about Americans, U.S. citizens, and they have a reputation of being crude and obese and blunt and rude, and God knows there's plenty of them that way. And then because Canadians say sorry a lot, there's this myth that they somehow are innately and inherently, apologetic or sweet-natured. Now, they may be pacifist or non-confrontational, but they certainly aren't inherently classy or nice, or vice versa with the United States. I could say this too. Germany, everybody acts like, well, German engineering, it's so brilliant. They're so smart. Really, they've done, the Germans did the dumbest thing in the last 1,000 years. I'm telling you, the stupidest thing that's been done in the last 1,000 years, Germans did it. So what I'm telling you is back away from the stereotypes. Be deeper than that. Be more rational. Be more sensitive. Be more empathetic. Be more critical in the way. Judge people based on their actions, not on their nomenclature or their categories. This is where we can fall apart as a society when the further we get away from our family, the less we're empathetic about anybody. Okay? So there's a fascinating article that was written in 2018, the New York Times, and it was talking about the Myanmar atrocities with the Rohingya people, okay? And the title of the article, look at this. Why are we surprised when Buddhists are violent? Okay? And it's a fascinating piece in the New York Times, because what happens is everybody gets this stereotype that religion of the Asians are somebody sitting there in a Tibetan outfit or a Buddhist outfit, or they're sitting there in orange or yellow robes, cross-legged, meditating, and now it's ubiquitous as yoga is. Well, my friend, Buddhists can be as evil as anybody else. Christians can be as evil, but they by definition are not Christian if they're that evil. Well, few sophisticated observers are shocked by the occurrence of religious violence. There is one notable exception in this regard. There remains a persistent and widespread belief that Buddhist societies really are peaceful and harmonious. This presumption is evident in the reactions of astonishment many people have to the events like those taking place in Myanmar. How many wonder could a Buddhist society, especially Buddhist monks themselves, have anything to do with something so monstrously violent as the ethnic cleansing now being perpetrated on Myanmar's long beleaguered Rohingya minority? Okay? That is because, okay, there is no shortage of historical examples of violence in Buddhist societies. Sri Lanka's long and tragic civil war, their civil war lasted from 1983 to 2009 in Sri Lanka. It involved a great deal of specifically Buddhist nationalism on the part of the majority, resentful of the presence of the minority. Okay? Political violence in modern Thailand has often been inflicted by the Buddhist involvement, and there's a growing body of scholarly literature on the martial complicity of Buddhist institutions in the World War II era Japanese nationalism. Even the history of the Dalai Lama's own sect of Tibetan Buddhism includes events like razing of rival monasteries. A recent decades have seen a controversy centering on a wrathful protector deity believed by some of the Dalai Lama's fellow religionists to heap destruction on the rival sect. Okay? So, does that mean that everybody who's a Buddhist is violent? No. But what it means is back away from the stereotypes. Quit becoming someone who just regurgitates what society is throwing to you. You have to be a truthful and deep speaker. Now, what's fascinating about this is the colonial discourse praised Burmese Buddhists for their tolerance, functioned in part to condemn the superstitious and backward practices of the caste Hindus and Muslims in colonial Myanmar. This discourse was picked up by Burmese nationalists and is now invoked tragically to justify violence towards the Rohingya Muslims. Now, here's what's fascinating. Immanuel Kant said that we are not transparent to ourselves and can never exhaustively know why we do what we do. We can never be certain whether or to what extent we have acted for the reasons we think we did, or whether we are under the sway of a psychological, neuropsychological, or socioeconomic cause that is altogether hidden to us. Okay? Now, most Buddhists are pacifists. Most Christians are pacifists. Okay? But the reality is that we have to allow our beliefs to inform our living. Okay? And so I got to thinking about this lately, because there's a famed preacher in the United States named Stephen Lawson. Okay? And he's big. He was the right hand. He sat at the right hand of John MacArthur's ministry. Okay? And so John MacArthur had this guy preach everything. He was involved in the master's seminary. And when John MacArthur does his interview, this is so fascinating to me. John MacArthur's sitting there on his platform. This is several weeks ago. And whoever the man was that was interviewing him starts asking him about Stephen Lawson. And Steve Lawson had been very vocal about everything and everyone. Okay, but he falls into an adulterous relationship with a 20-something-year-old girl that had been associated in some degree with the ministry. So anyhow, he asked John MacArthur about it. John MacArthur says he's shocked, right? Because this guy's theology is so good. And this is what's fascinating to me, is that there was the assumption that because someone has orthodoxy, that they'll have orthopraxy, which is a practice of living. And that's not true. Because you can say the right things and it never translate into living or doing the right thing. There's a difference between knowing what to say and doing what you believe. Okay? And so many of history's great philosophers would themselves acknowledge that while all religions typically emphasize some type of compassion or pacifism, that actually living it in ways informed by that belief are harder. To be really changed by a belief regarding one's relationship to all other beings, one must cultivate that belief. One must come to experience it as a vividly real through the disciplined practices of what you speak. Okay? So what I'm warning about on this is you can't just assume that because you feel something or know something, that's going to translate into an orthopraxy. You can know, I mean, that's why, like, you can go back in history and find men that were uber articulate, that could preach and could speak and could articulate to, I mean, just masterfully do it. And then they were living with someone else. And you're like, how can this be? Because what happens is you begin to regurgitate the right thing, or the thing that the social construct in which you're involved says you have to say. You say it, but it doesn't translate to living. And this is why someone can have an extreme orthodoxy in their preaching or in their moral and ethical code and articulation of said code, and somehow live a separate, complete life. Because none of this is just assumed that because you fit into this bracketed title that I'm a Pentecostal apostolic, or I'm a Christian, or I'm a Buddhist, or I'm whatever you say you are, it has to translate into a living pattern. And so what happens is we put the blinders on and we stop thinking. And this is where the Apostle John tells them in 1 John chapter 4, try the spirits, whether they be of God or not. He didn't say try their words. He said try their spirits, because someone can have all the right things to say and their spirit be completely wrong. Okay? You could understand that, well, this is going to work because it's the right thing to say, but somehow it breaks down and it becomes something they never live out and they never practice. Okay? So there's a fascinating saying that was said by a great modern day philosopher. He says that when religion is not part of the solution, it will most certainly become part of the problem. And that is never more true than it is today. When religion and religious people do not become part of the solution, then they will most certainly be part of the problem. There are people that assume that because they're of a certain political party or they're of a certain religious construct, that they're automatically going to be the right thing and do the right thing. And that's not the truth. The truth is you got to dig in and be deeply insightful and critical, even of oneself. Critical of, am I actually living what I'm preaching? Am I actually going out and putting it in practice and doing it? Or am I just regurgitating what I know the community that I'm a part of wants to hear? And I think that's what happens sometimes, is people begin to master what the community expects, but they never master how to put it into practice. And so you say, well, what are we to do with that? Don't lose your savor. Don't just be called salt. Be salty. Don't just be called light. Be bright. There's a huge difference in saying, I am the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its savor, what is the point of it? If the Christian has lost its influence, or its desire to influence at least, what is the point of it? And we as North Americans especially can become so blinded to the fact that the world lies in wickedness. It lays in a place of absolute distrust and disdain to the things of God. It is our job to be ambassadorial. It is our job to be the ambassadors. And that is why Paul literally tells them that you're the ministers of Christ. You're ambassadors. Paul calls himself an ambassador of Christ. What does an ambassador do? An ambassador comes from a nation, goes to a foreign people, and becomes an intermediary between the sitting and reigning power and the foreign entity. The ambassador doesn't move in and assimilate and then start regurgitating the foreign land and the foreign policy that he's living among. If he does, he's called a traitor. It's our job as Christians to be in this world, but we're not of this world. We are ambassadors of Christ to a fallen and degenerate world. Don't fall into their nomenclature and their verbiage and the words that they use over and over. Think deeply and critically about this. Okay? And this is fascinating to me because we sometimes think that political mechanism somehow is going to fix where we're at. It's not going to fix where we're at. No human entity can and has done it yet. And so just I'm going to just explain this to you. Because each political entity that gets in it's thinking about its own nation. It's thinking about it, America first. It's thinking about what's good for Canadians. But the Christian thinks about what's good for humanity. The average North American consumes 5 times more than the average Mexican does. Think about that. We are consuming goods to a degree that we're out-consuming everybody, and so we're looking for political messiahs that are going to help me consume more. But does that really fix the problem? Let's say, let's play this game with the time I have left. Let's say that America gets the politician that country needs. Let's say that Canada gets the politician in charge that country needs. Let's play this out. The average North American consumes 5 times more than a Mexican, 10 times more than a Chinese person, 30 times more than an Indian person. With the right politician in the United States, whoever you think that is, with the right Canadian politician, whoever you think that is, do you think God is stoked because you can now consume 35 times more than the average Indian? Or you can consume 15 times more than the average Chinese person? There are 1.3 billion people, 22% of the world's population living below the poverty line. 841 million people right now are malnourished. Right now. 841 million. Do you think God is stoked because we get a 5% increase or a 3% decrease in taxes? I'll tell you what God's listening to. He's listening to the cries of 841 million malnourished people. 880 million are without access to any medical care at all. 1 billion people on planet Earth right now lack shelter. 1.3 billion have no access to safe drinking water. 2.6 billion people go without any sanitation whatsoever. Among the children of the world, 2/3 of them are girls, go without schooling. 150 million children right now are malnourished. 30,000 children a day die from preventable diseases. I'm so glad that we got the politician in we wanted this year, or didn't want. I'm so glad that consumes so much of what it was, because we are not supposed to think at the shallowest and surface level of what our own contentments are. We're called to think beyond where we're at. Now, in 18 countries, life expectancy is less than 30 years. Right now. And right now, there are 18 countries on planet Earth where the life expectancy is under 30 years. In Sierra Leone, the life expectancy is 37 years. Infant mortality rates are higher than 1 in 10 children in 35 countries. Are we really thinking deeply? Or are we thinking selfishly? Now, I'm here, right? I'm living here. So what do I want? The worst that I can have? No, I'm going to have a pick. I use my vote to vote for what empowers me. But listen to me. I'm not stoked about that part. Because if I make 4% more or I make 5% less this year, It is a grand, wonderful life God has given me. What keeps me up at night is there's 18 countries that they don't even live to 30 years old yet. There are billions of people that have no sanitation services. Now, I get into the whole reading of the news, and I'm not opposed to that, okay? And especially when it spikes. Like I was talking about it last night to some friends of mine. The day that they arrested Donald Trump, I just put it on my laptop and just let it run. It was stunning to me that a ex-president of the United States was being arrested and booked, and it was history in the making. I was fascinated by it, right? Now, once that's done, let's go back to trying to figure out how can we build churches that are around wells that offer people clean water in areas where over 1 billion people don't have access to clean water. But you know what troubles me? It's not that people get involved in politics in an election cycle. It's when that's all they talk about. I'm not worried about November. That doesn't bother me. The question is, what are we going to do in December when there's families that don't have food to eat? What are we going to do about that? What are we going to do about building the next church? Are we just going to build it to where it's a great Instagram post? Or are we going to think, let's put a filter system where it gives all of that community free, clean water, and that becomes part of the missional budget of what we're trying to accomplish around that church? Can we build a church and put a water filtration system that anybody in that community gets free water, and we tell that pastor, on that condition, we're going to build you a new church, but your church has to be around water that provides that to your local community? Is there a way to merge these things? Is there a way to create some of my wealth, some of the wealth that's here in Canada and in the United States, and take North American wealth and say, let's not just rally because now we consume 11 times more than a Chinese person, or we consume 50 times more than an African in Sierra Leone or wherever, or an African in any of these other places. Is that really worth living my life intoxicated by that every day? Or let's get together and say, let's build a new thing and let's do something that really changes. So what I'm saying is, back away from a culture who is running at the shallowest level they can run at, and let's think deeply and critically about the issues that are challenging our day. We are committed to us the ministry of reconciliation. Let's use it. Let's change the world we live in. Let's go to bed at night and say, we've done something with the resources that's been given.